It'll reward me, actually. It's a little more selfish on my end, is that these questions always have something behind them. They're never just a curiosity. There's always some level of struggle or something we're looking for in terms of an answer that means something to us very important, or someone that we know or love.
Our first question that we have submitted this morning, so it goes like this. I have a good friend who is Muslim. How can I share the gospel to my friend in a respectful way?
Great question. And I really appreciate the way that the question is being asked, because a lot of times what you see online and in various ways is you see people engaging with a worldview. So they're engaging the worldview of Islam. And that's fine, we can do that. But really, when you're engaging the worldview of Islam, you're engaging those who hold the worldview of Islam. So you're really engaging Muslims. And so I love the way this question is actually asked, because one, you have a good friend who's a Muslim. That's to be commended already. We are supposed to have, and I think intentionally should have, friends of ours who don't share everything in the same commonality of Islam that we do. And that's fine, we can do that. But really, when you're engaging the worldview of Islam, you're engaging those who hold the worldview of Islam. And we want to do it. So you're really engaging Muslims. And so I love the way this question is actually asked, because one, you have a good friend who's a Muslim. That's to be commended already. We are supposed to have, and I think everyone who asks should have friends of ours who don't share everything in the same commonality of Islam that we do. And that's fine, we can do that. Really, when you're engaging the worldview of Islam, you're engaging those who hold the worldview of Islam. And we want to do it. So you're really engaging Muslims. So I love the way this question is actually asked, because one, you have a good friend share a reason. That's to be commended already. We are supposed to have, and I think everyone who asks should have. Now, I don't know friends of ours who don't share everything in the same commonality of Islam that we do. And that's fine. We can do that. Really, when you're engaging the worldview of Islam, you're engaging those who hold the worldview of Islam. And we want to do it. So you're really engaging Muslims. So I love the way this question is actually asked, because one, you have a good friend share a reason. That's to be commended already. We are supposed to have, and I think everyone who asks should have. I don't know friends of ours who don't share everything in the same commonality of Islam that we do. And that's fine. We can do that. Really, when you're engaging the worldview of Islam, you're engaging those who hold the worldview of Islam. And you're really engaging Muslims. So I love the way this question is actually asked, because one, you have a good friend share a reason. That's to be commended already. We are supposed to have, and I think everyone who asks should have. I don't know friends of ours. You want to go sit down at a restaurant, at the counter of a restaurant, and there's a seat next to them. And they say, really, when you're engaging, is this seat saved? And they say, no, but are you saved? You know, they're always asking you if you're saved. And they say, have you seen my keys? They say, oh, you need the keys to the kingdom. That's to be clear. If you don't know any oversaved people, you're probably oversaved. But there's Muslims like that too, who talk about religion all the time, and that's all they ever talk about. So they have a spectrum. And so what I'm saying is it's important for us to actually engage in the questions of our friends, because you begin to realize what level of degree they actually hold to various things that would be Islamic. So first, I would say this. If you understand or get to understand some fundamentals of Islam before you talk to a Muslim, that's a great thing. Now, you don't have to do this, but if you do, that's great, because when you ask questions of a Muslim friend, you'll begin to see what level of commitment they actually hold to. So basically, there's 6 fundamental beliefs, and there's 5 pillars of Islam. The 6 fundamental beliefs are beliefs that Muslims hold. The 5 pillars are the 5 things a Muslim must practice in order to be a good Muslim. If you know these things and some basics behind this, and it's very quick you can very quickly do it, then you can ask questions. So a good example, let's say you have a Muslim friend who's a woman, and she is muhajjabi, she wears a hijab. She wears the scarf or the veil over her hair. Or maybe she wears niqab, she wears it over her whole face. A great question to ask, it's non-threatening, it's very respectful, is to say, what is that all about? Why do you wear that? What does it mean? Is it important to you? Is it something that you feel compelled to wear, like by family or society, or do you do it because you want to do it? And just listen for the answer and find out what's going on there. And a great question to ask a Muslim is, what do you think of Jesus? And they have a very serious opinion about Jesus, because Muslims believe that Jesus was a prophet of God, but that's all he was. He was nothing more than a man who did in fact perform miracles, but he was a conduit through which God performed miracles, including raising people from the dead and other things. But they believe that he was only a man and was not the divine Son of God. So when you ask a Muslim, what is your view of Jesus, they'll say things like, we love and respect him, he was a wonderful man of God, he was sinless, and all these things. And that can lead you to eventually say, well, what do you think about what the Bible has to say about Jesus? And now you're having a very serious conversation. Listen more than you talk at this point. At some point, you're going to have a chance to talk more than you listen. But if you understand what their worldview actually is, what they actually believe about Jesus, it gives you an inroad to say what you think about Jesus. Now, be prepared, by the way, because many Muslims are, I call it the informal academy of the Western Muslim home. Most Muslims, especially boys, but oftentimes girls as well, are sat down by their parents and told, here's why Christianity is false. Here's the 5 reasons Christianity is false, and here's the 5 reasons you should tell your Christian friends why Islam is true. So be prepared for the fact that they probably already have arguments against Christianity ready to go when you're having the conversation. Now, normally, if you're a friend, they won't engage in a hostile quarrel. They might give you an argument, but an argument and a quarrel are 2 different things. An argument is simply a set of premises and evidences that, if true, lead to a conclusion. A quarrel is when you're yelling and screaming at each other. Now, hopefully it won't devolve into a quarrel, but you can give an argument, and you can receive an argument, and you can interact with an argument. Muslims like discussing and arguing about religion. They like doing that, and it's perfectly fine. You're not going to offend them with that. And by the way, they're not made of porcelain. You know, we have this view right now in the West that if you look at anybody else's religion and you say, I'm not sure I buy that, that somehow that's an offensive thing, and that if they're made of porcelain, you'll shoot a little thing at them and they'll shatter into a million pieces in an outrage and an immoral, sort of anger, and you'll lose your friend. That's not true. Muslims expect Christians to disagree with them. They expect it. And then when you don't, they're like, well, wait a minute, do you even believe what you say you believe? Because they know you don't believe the same thing. They know that. So I think that being upfront about the differences is fine. So asking questions gets them to open up. It's not offensive in any way to ask a question, especially if you want to get an answer or get the information out of it. That's one. Number 2 is that when you ask questions, you'll realize what level of commitment that Muslim actually has. I remember being invited to go to a Muslim's house to speak to them about the resurrection of Jesus, because Muslims believe that Jesus didn't even die on a cross, let alone rise from the dead. So I was there to give the historical evidence for the resurrection of Jesus. Well, I walked into this guy's house, and me and a friend were there, and his wife answers the door, his wife and her sister, and she's muhajjabi, she's a very committed Muslim. And she says, okay, well, my husband, he's not home from work yet, he'll be home very soon, he said he's on his way, so he'll be home very soon. Please come in, treat yourself to some coffee and cake, which I said before doesn't mean coffee and cake, it means coffee and a meal. Her and her sister went into a room and waited for her husband to come, because they couldn't be alone with us in the room, because they were very Orthodox Muslims. But her husband came home from his job as a dealer at the local casino. Now, if you know anything about Islam, you know that this is not what a Muslim does if they're committed. Muslims are not supposed to gamble, and they're not supposed to make money off of others gambling, and yet his job was to help people gamble. So that told me a lot about his commitment level. So he walked in and we had a conversation, and the fact is that he stopped me in the middle of my conversation about the resurrection of Jesus, and he said, hold on, my big problem is not this. My big issue is, how do you know God even exists if there's so much suffering and pain in the world? He was an agnostic, but he used the label Muslim because he's supposed to, because that's his culture. So just a few questions and just a few moments of listening revealed that this man's commitment level to his Islam was not that high. His wife's was very high. His level was not that high at all. So I got to shift what I spoke about. See, the Apostle Paul says is that to walk in wisdom toward outsiders, making the best use of the time, Colossians chapter 4, verse 5. Walk in wisdom toward outsiders, making the best use of the time, which means answer the question they're actually asking. So if you assume you're going to have to defend the deity of Christ and all these things with a Muslim, you might have to. But you might not have to, because they might be saying, I'm not sure I believe in God at all. And you can get to the heart of the issue. So listen. Ask questions and then listen. And then the third thing is, if they are a committed Muslim of any level, I think finding a common platform upon which you can talk and then jump off into the pools that are available to us is important. You know, people use these analogies of bridges. You know, you build a bridge. If you build a bridge with somebody, you find a commonality and you build a bridge so you can talk. I understand what's going on here, what the point of this is, but I actually don't like bridge analogies, because bridges can be two-way streets. In other words, you are just as open as they are. And I'm not saying be closed-minded, but you're just as open to changing your view as they are. Now, that's not inherently a bad thing in normal discourse, but if you're giving your convictions over to the gospel, what you want to do is not have a common bridge, you want a common platform. So here we're standing on a platform, but let's imagine a platform. There's different platforms you can stand on, and you come to the common platform, and it's very, very high, and there are pools that are offered to you to jump into from the platform. Some have a little bit of water, some have no water at all, only one is totally full. And so you're trying to decide with your Muslim friend, which pool do we jump off into from the common platform? So what is the common platform that Christians and Muslims actually have? And there's an important one. This one is what really got me thinking about the nature of who God is in the gospel when I was a Muslim. The common platform is this. You've heard Muslims say the word Allahu Akbar, right? You've heard this phrase. Usually you hear it on the news, and when you hear it, something bad happens right after. Something explodes or someone loses their head or whatever it might be. This is terribly unfortunate, because most Muslims actually don't use the phrase Allahu Akbar as a terrorist chant or a battle cry. They don't. What they use it for, it literally means God is greater. And so they use it as a prayer and a praise all the time. So if they walk into a beautiful home and they've been invited to be a guest at, they'll say, Allahu Akbar, God is so great, look how he's blessed you. Or if they get bad news, you know, whether it's bad medical issue or something bad has happened, they lost their job, they'll say, Allahu Akbar, God is greater than my circumstances. So God's greatness is the central idea of Islam. In fact, I rejected the Trinity, the Incarnation, and the cross of Christ when I was a Muslim, because I thought those were the things that insulted God's greatness. Because God's greatness was the most important thing for me as a Muslim. But a Christian also values God's greatness. Psalm 145, how great are you, O Lord? Your greatness is unsearchable. So God's greatness, that we believe in a God who is the ultimate being, he is the greatest possible being, is something we have in common with Muslims. There's one God, only one God, and he is the greatest being. There can be no being greater than that one God. So now you have respect with that Muslim because you share a common platform. Now the question is, which religious system or which system of belief actually makes sense of God being truly great? Which system makes sense? And so if I look at the Trinity and the incarnation of God in Christ and the cross, I have now come to see these things don't insult God's greatness. These are the things that demonstrate God's greatness. I'll give you the one example. If you were here at the Good Friday service, you may hear this again because I said it before. If God is the greatest possible being, and Muslims believe that, and so do Christians, then he would express the greatest possible ethic, which is love. That's naturally and logically the case. he didn't express love the greatest possible way, he wouldn't be the greatest possible being. But how would he express love in the greatest possible way, which is self-sacrifice? There's no other way we can conceive of to express love greater than self-sacrifice. If we can do that, and we're sinful, flawed human beings, ought not God, who is greater than all beings, be able to express love in this greatest of possible ways, which is self-sacrifice? And if he can't, like in Islam, if he can't, then how is he greater than us? He actually might be less than us in one sense. But no, the Christian faith says that God is so great that he not only sacrifices for those he loves like we do, but he actually sacrifices for those he loves and who hate him back. So God doesn't sacrifice for those who love him. God sacrifices for those who hate him to transform them into those who love him. We will sacrifice for someone who loves us back, or maybe a stranger, but we won't do it for someone who hates us. But the gospel says that God is the greatest possible being who expresses the greatest possible ethic in the greatest possible way. And so when you come along on this common platform of God's greatness, this is but one example, and there are various ones, where you can actually say to a friend, a Muslim friend, I want to understand what you mean by God being great, and here's what I have to offer you as a Christian as to why I think God is truly great in the Christian message. Do you have anything comparable to that in the Quran or in Islam? And I think that'll help move the ball forward. So you've respected them in asking them questions, understanding who they are, and you've respected them in the common platform you have with them, but you've also respected them in saying, I take your religion seriously enough to disagree with it. Because if we agree with everything all the time, then we're not actually taking people seriously, because their religion and your religion don't teach the same thing. And if you say they do, you've not taken either one of them seriously, and you haven't respected either one. So questions, understanding, and then offering them the answer to their deepest longing, which is to worship a God who is great. I think that's the greatest way to show them something of the respect that they deserve and show them the gospel that they desperately need.
All right, thank you, Abdu. Again, just a reminder, if any of you here in the room have a question, you're welcome to also just come up to the front and ask it, and we would prioritize that. But just looking at the questions that we do have, this first one, okay.
Oh, excellent.
Here we go.
Hi.
Hi.
I haven't really thought about how to word my question, but I think from my experience, I found that atheism is not necessarily the worldview that we see today, but more so apathy or chosen ignorance. Other people might see your choice of religion as just like your favorite flavor of ice cream. That's all it is. No, there's no need for absolute truth.
Mm-hmm.
How do you navigate that, or how can we have better conversations with our friends, or have them think more on this topic?
Yeah, great question. In fact, someone once asked me what's the hardest question I've ever been asked before. And I had to think a while about it, but it's not the hardest question conceptually, like it's not the hardest intellectually challenging question I've ever been asked, but it's the hardest question I've been asked because you're trying to get someone else to care about something. And that's incredibly hard to get them to do, because you can't make them care about something if they truly, honestly don't care about it. One author put it that atheism isn't the predominant religion, it's apatheism. It's people who are apathetic about God. And they don't really care that much. And so one of the hardest questions I ever get is, everything in my life is going well. I'm in a free country. I have relative prosperity relative to the rest of the world. I have a good spouse. My kids are doing well. And my career is pretty nice. What do I need your God for? Now, the reason behind this is because people have an inherent belief that people have an inherent assumption that people believe in God because they need some kind of a crutch to get through life. Now, in one sense, that's wrong. We don't believe in God because, I don't believe in God because I need something to get me through the emotional issues of the day. C.S. Lewis said, if I wanted to believe in God to be happy, I could just go to a good glass of port after dinner and get that. But in one sense, it's also true. We recognize something. We actually do need something. We need a crutch. In fact, I don't even need a crutch. I need a stretcher to get me through life. Because the person who says, I don't really need God, and what does all this matter anyway? Who cares? is making an assumption that all the blessings of their life they got themselves or were luck. Now, what if it's not that? What if it comes from a source that's actually greater than just mere luck, mere chance, or even your own hard work? What if your very ability to do hard work in the first place? What if the intellect you were born with, which, by the way, you didn't earn, you either have it or you don't, is not something that came about by blind, pitiless indifference, but actually came about because a God endowed you and blessed you with it? Could you imagine looking at your parents and they have provided such a life for you through sacrifice and saying, what do I need you for? I got my degree, I did well, I have my PhD, I'm gonna go do this and this and this. Can you imagine such a thing? Could you imagine saying, I don't really need you? The level of ingratitude there is almost staggering. And the level of pompousness, and it's not even true. You didn't get there by yourself. I think the way to do this is actually through questions. Again, I think questions are an important way. So I was encountering somebody who basically had this idea, what do I need God for? Things are going pretty well. I had a couple of questions. When they don't, what happens next? And by the way, they're going pretty well, right? Yeah. Did you plan for that? And the answer is almost always yeah. I worked hard to get to the school that I got into. I didn't pick a random arbitrary school. This is the school I wanted, and this is the school I tried to get into. Yeah, I had some safety schools I applied to as well, but this is the school I really wanted to get into. Okay, did you plan for that? Yes. Did you work hard towards getting that? Yes. So you care about your future? Yes. How about the job you have? Did you happen to in it by accident? Well, no, I planned my life out this way, and yeah, there were some things that came unexpectedly, but we worked through them and all that. Great. How about your retirement? Did you plan for your retirement? Yeah. I'm trying to plan for my future investments for my retirement and also to take care of kids when I have them and all that stuff. So your future really matters to you. Yeah. Why doesn't your eternal destiny matter to you? Why would you plan for things in this life and not consider the possibility that maybe there's something beyond this life? Now, maybe there's not, but you don't know that. Why wouldn't you find out? You spend all this time and effort and resource planning for your temporal future. Have you even considered the possibility that there's more beyond this? And if they say no, say, is that a rational position to take? What if there's more than that? Now, they might not say anything. They might say, well, yeah, I don't think about that kind of stuff. I would press them with one more question. Don't do too many, because after a while you can become annoying, which is, why? Why don't those questions pop into your mind? Well, they just don't matter to me, but everything else does. So that's one way to do it. Another way is to realize that most people are not apathetic about everything. Okay, people care about a lot of things. There's very few people, I think, who aren't passionate about at least something in society. Look, if the past 2.5 years have showed us anything, I mean, here's the reality, okay? Here, this thing. You're all wearing them, and I have in my pocket. I cared nothing about these things 3 years ago. The world did not care about these things 3 years ago. And I've traveled in lots of Asian countries, and I noticed something when I was in Asia, way before the pandemic. Half the people in the airport wore a mask. I had no opinion about that. You want to wear a mask? Wear a mask. You don't want to? Don't wear a mask. I didn't care. Suddenly, this thing became political in the West. Not in the East, but in the West. Do you or do you not wear a mask? Should the government enforce you and make you wear a mask? We care about stuff. Almost no one is truly apathetic about anything. So what I would say is a way to have a productive conversation is to find out what someone does care about. Because here's what I would say, that every issue someone cares about is based on values. It's based on values. So the mask issue, the mask mandate, what's the value? What's the underlying value in the debate? The underlying value in the debate is the idea of individual freedom. Should the government tell us you should or should not wear something? Should a building, the people who own the building, tell me if I should or should not wear something? The vaccine mandate, same thing. The whole trucker thing that went over to Ottawa, all of that. That's all based on the value of what does freedom actually look like, what does it mean, and how can it actually be expressed? So people have strong opinions. People are not lacking in conviction. They're lacking maybe in religious conviction. So if I were to have a conversation with somebody and ask them, in fact, my wife's sitting here. We were having a conversation with somebody who was, he was a Muslim and he turned an atheist. And he was a doctor, and he helped a lot of people around the world, and he still was doing that, helping people around the world. And we were having this conversation. The people who were there were Christians hoping to get him to convert, and so they had me as a former Muslim come and talk to him and all this, but he was a former Muslim, now an atheist. I was a former Muslim, now a Christian. So she asked him a brilliant question, and it was simple. And when I say it's brilliant, it's not that in its substance it was brilliant, it was brilliantly timed. Because she asked him, she said, hey, what gets you out of bed in the morning? What inspires you? And he said, oh, easy, helping people. People are my inspiration. Now, I'm a smart aleck, so I said, why? You know, she wasn't being that. She actually wanted to know the answer. I was going to be a smart aleck, and I said, why? And he says, what do you mean, why? Like it was the dumbest question he's ever heard in his life. I said, no, I'm really curious because you say you're an atheist, and you're a doctor, and we talked about what human beings actually are, and according to you, they're basically just complex biochemical machines. That's what they are. So my question for you now is, if we're just complex biochemical machines, you're just one machine, like a robot in a factory, working on other robots in the factory. Why does that inspire you? What's inspiring about that? How are you a doctor who is part of a noble profession of people who minister in a medical way to people in their deepest physical need? How are you part of a noble profession that does that, as opposed to being just an overly expensively educated mechanic? He didn't like that. Now, he didn't get upset at me or hostile at me, but the point is that question that she asked so brilliantly was, what do you care about? And that leads to a discussion about why should you care about it? And there's always value behind that. And so the Christian faith is a faith that says, this is a world that is laced with moral value. It's woven into the fabric of reality. Purpose is woven into the fabric of reality. So if someone's got a profession, medical, sports, engineering, or whatever, and at some point say, why do you care about what you care about? Maybe they care about music. Maybe they're an engineer, they like being an engineer because it makes money, and they do a good job, and they're somewhat interested in computers. But what they really care about is the Beatles. They care a lot about music. Why? What about it? Why don't apes care about it? Why don't termites care about it? What is it about us that makes us care about this, beyond an evolutionary framework? See what I'm getting at? Is that someone's passionate about something. And in this world, we're passionate about social justice and all these other things. Great, fantastic. These are wonderful inroads to actually get to the gospel, because everything we're passionate about has a value system and a morality behind it. And the gospel is all about the justification for why we should care about anything. So I hope that helps. I think questions is a great way to do it. Find out what someone cares about, and then ask them why they care about it, and then find out a way in which the gospel actually wedges itself in, because it always does. I've never been disappointed with this. It always wedges itself in to the questions about people's convictions. Hope that's helpful. My pleasure. Thank you. Great question. Great question.
Yeah, actually, and just following on that theme, and so we do seem to have a lot of questions with interacting, I guess, with the, you could say, outside world from the church. Yeah. I'll just mention again as we can continue on. If you submitted a question and you're hoping that Abdu answers it, I would say the best way to get your question answered is to come to the front and ask it, because we do have quite a few in the queue. And so if you really are dying to hear what the answer to your question is, I would encourage you to come to the front.
I love the fact that here in church you just gave them a cheat code.
Yes. Yeah. So, moving on. So again, as the world increasingly gets more hostile, this next question asks: you say that Christianity is the answer to all the hatred, oppression, and discrimination. Yet there are Christians who are part of this problem. How do we explain this to a non-believer who hates the church but likes the God in Christianity?
That's an incredibly well-worded question. In fact, let me just suggest this to you as well. So this is a shameless plug. I wrote a book about this, and it's coming out in September, called More Than a White Man's Religion. And it speaks about the realities of the fact that Christians have not always lived consistently, sometimes horribly so. People who call themselves Christians, who I think actually might have actually been real Christians, who have acted horribly in response to that. A good example is George Whitefield. George Whitefield is a well-known and often quoted giant of Christian theology, but he owned slaves and actually preached to slaves and helped them to stay in sort of a slavery position. Now, he wanted them saved, but he did not want them freed necessarily. So that's something we have to wrestle with. There are other people as well, Jonathan Edwards and some of these folks. They weren't perfect people and they were a product of their times, but there were some serious issues there. Today, right now, there are people who are in fact a part of the problem. I think this is important though, okay? This is an important distinction to make. Let me just use the American experience as an illustration because I'm sure it'll apply here in Canada as well. There are people who call themselves Christians because they're not atheists, and they're not Muslims, and they're not Buddhists, and they're not Jews. So they believe in God, but really their priorities are, I'm a conservative, American, Republican Christian, in that order. And so the Christian part is a distant fourth in terms of their commitment level. So they say they're Christian because they were raised in a Christian home, or they were raised with a Christian label. Now, that is part of the problem. And so we have to point out that there are those who, and I'm not against being conservative, I'm quite a conservative guy myself, but conservatism doesn't drive. It isn't the central ism of my life. Following Christ is the central ism of my life. And things that are antithetical to that, I will have to reject at some point because I think they don't comport with that. But there are people in the modern church who are part of the problem. Our goal is to actually point it out. We don't have to cancel anybody or shame anybody out of this kind of thing, but we do have to live authentically Christian lives ourselves. Because I can't remember who it was. It may have been Francis of Assisi. He's quoted as saying this all the time, is that preach the gospel, if necessary, use words. What he means by that is not we don't do proclamation evangelism. Of course we do. But what he means is that if you live your life authentically Christian, you will shock people who have now built a stereotype about the hatred and the sort of bigotry that they've assessed to Christianity, and they'll say, you don't fit this mold. And the more of us who don't fit this mold, the less and less the stereotype will actually take place and adhere. So I think that's an important thing for us to do, is to live authentically. 1 Peter 3:15 is an interesting verse because it says that we are to always be prepared to provide a reason, the apologia, the defense, for the hope that we have to anyone who asks. Now that's an important question, an important issue for us to confront ourselves with. Peter says, provide a reason, the defense, for the hope you have. So you have to live a life that is hope-filled. To anyone who asks, now I'm not saying you have to wait for them to ask you a question, but what Peter is basically saying, and by the way, he's saying this in a time of persecution when Christians aren't, in fact, highly favored amongst the nations. He says, you offer hope to anyone who asks, which means you have to be the kind of person another person wants to ask about hope. Am I the kind of person that another person says, you seem to have hope, what's with you? And actually get a response with gentleness and with respect. In other words, the best way to respond to people who seem to like the God of Christianity but aren't so happy with the church is to be the church who also likes the God of Christianity and is willing to submit to him. So I think it's important that Christians actually take a look at the life of Christ, take a look at the life of the apostles, take a look at the scriptures very seriously and live consistently with those, as opposed to being Christians who became Christians solely for the salvation. Paul says that we are to confess that Jesus is Lord and Savior, not just Savior, but also Lord. And so it was Dallas Willard who coined the phrase vampire Christians. There are those people who believe in Jesus just for his blood. All they want is the salvation. They don't want to make him Lord. And so we have to live consistently so that those who we know and we can encounter can have their stereotypes of a judgmental part of the problem church be shattered by this, be shattered by it. Also recognizing the good that Christian history has done in the world. The church has actually done far more good than it does harm in the world. Far more. I mean, how often do you go by St. Thus and Such church? St. Thus and Such hospital. Or there's a system of hospitals in the U.S. called the Ascension, meaning the ascension of Christ to heaven. Hospital system. You know what you don't see? Church of the, blessed atheist. You don't see very many of those. Now, I'm not saying that atheists aren't trying to set up good things. I'm not saying that, but the Christian message and the church itself has been a catalyst for some of the biggest institutional changes in the history of the world for the better, for the positive. We led the world in this stuff. Mark Twain once was quoted as saying that history does not repeat, but it does rhyme. And you look at the way in which the plague was handled by Christians. So plague ships were teetering in the water off the coast, unable to dock in the harbors in Europe when the plague was happening. The people who were filled with plague were on these ships. It was Christians who got on the little skiffs and went out there to minister, and even got plague themselves, trying to minister and help those who were dying of plague, because they thought that their lives mattered as much as their own lives, and they were willing to risk everything to help these people. Fast forward quite a while later, and you have the story that was happening, I think 5 or 6 years ago, where doctors, Christian doctors, were going into Ebola-infested Africa and trying to help people who had Ebola, knowing that they well could get Ebola themselves, and in fact did get Ebola, trying to help people get over this wretched, horrible disease. History does not repeat, but it sure does rhyme. Now, in the context of the division and hatred that's going on in our world today, whether ethnically or whatever it might be, yes, there are Christians who are the problem. I think that if we see people who seem to like the God of Christianity, we can say, okay, these people have acted inconsistently. Let me speak to you more about the God of Christianity. And so the church can be built up. I get a little bit nervous about speaking too ill of the church because, yes, there are issues. It's run by imperfect people, and there are problems in the church. There's no question about that. We're seeing this more and more of Christians behaving badly. We're seeing this all over the place. But the reality is as well is that the church is the body of Christ, and our job is not to join the world in insulting her, but to actually join in with Christ in edifying her and in building her up. So the first priority is to reach people so that they can see who Christ actually is. But along the way, it's also to build the church up and live our lives consistently with Christ so that people won't say, like Gandhi said, I like your Christ, I just don't like your Christian. Well, what if we could actually get them to like them both? So we have to live consistently, but speak to what the Bible actually says and focus on the life of Christ in our evangelism. And I think that we can start to get over some of this stuff. People are shocked when they find out the way Jesus treated women and the way Jesus treated ethnic minorities and ethnic outcasts. They're shocked by this because they did not expect it, because they, much like these so-called Christians who only label themselves Christians but are really, all these other things first, they haven't read their Bibles either, these people who aren't believers. And they can be educated and shocked by the beauty of who Christ actually is.
Thank you, Abdu. Continuing on that same trend of talking to
Sure.
others, this next question, I have a friend who identifies as trans or non-binary. How should I interact with them? Should I use preferred pronouns? They seem to be pretty resistant to Christianity because of their parents' homophobia. How can I share the gospel with them?
Yeah, that's a tough one too, because there's so much baggage laced there. There's so much about the parents. There's so much about all these issues. There's a phrase, I mentioned it yesterday, is that hurt people hurt people. So when you're a hurt person, sometimes what ends up happening is you hurt other people. But even beyond that, if you're a hurt person, sometimes your ears and your heart become more closed to various things because you've experienced hurts. And so and I appreciate the way this question is asked, because if someone is identifying as trans or non-binary, there's two things that could be going on there. One is that they actually do have gender dysphoria, and they feel that their mind and their body don't match up. Because their body isn't non-binary. It's clearly binary. People who are intersex, who have both genitalia, are extraordinarily rare, and usually they actually dominantly favor one gender over the other or one sex over the other in terms of their actual physical makeup. So people's bodies aren't not non-binary. Their mentality might be non-binary. But oftentimes, if someone has actual, genuine gender dysphoria, this is a real thing, it actually impacts an extremely small number of people. Genuine, pervasive gender dysphoria, where your mind and your body don't seem to match up. Your body is the sex, the physical sex of the body is male or female, but the mind says, I don't feel like a male or a female. And having that pervade past, for lack of a better word, a phase when you're a teenager, because it usually kids experience this very early on. They're sort of confused as they're figuring out their bodies, and then into their teen years, a vast majority of the time, it fades away. So when it persists beyond that, to the point where a person actually feels almost a mental anguish over the dysphoria between what they think or how they feel and what their body actually is, that's genuine gender dysphoria. That's extremely rare. That's exceedingly rare. And so what you're seeing in the culture right now is sort of a surge in the willingness to identify as trans and non-binary. I don't know if it's actually because more people than we thought were actually trans or non-binary. I think it's actually because there's something of a social phenomenon happening there, where being identified as trans or non-binary is a way to assert control and find identity in a world where you don't actually know who you are or what you are, not because you're actually gender dysphoric, but because you're trying to search for a sense of identity. All of us are trying to search for that as well. So what I would focus on with a person like that, who identifies this way, is I would not make it the central point of the conversation. Because Jesus is not interested in getting you primarily to see that you're male or female. That's important, don't get me wrong on this. I'm not interested in getting a homosexual person to stop being homosexual. I'm interested in getting a person who's homosexual saved and showing them who Christ actually is and who they are and valued in Christ. The rest will sort of work it out. I mean, think about this. If you talk to somebody who's got some other issue in their life, whether they're given to, sexual immorality of some kind, or they're prideful, or they have some level of anger in their life, whatever it is, we don't try to make them an unangry person and then get them saved. No, we try to get them to see with the heart of Christ, what he wants for them, and then get them saved and say, this is the truth of who Jesus is. Jesus values you so much that he's willing to pay whatever it takes to get you into heaven. That's how you know you have objective value, because the objective one paid an objective price for you to get into heaven. That's the only solution that is actually out there for human value. Get them to see the beauty of the gospel. That's the primary thing. What they're expecting you to do is make their gender identity issues the primary issue. I would not make it the primary issue. I would make Jesus' love for them and God's love for them and the historical reality, what he did for them, the primary issue. Love them through, regardless of what they say. You don't have to agree with it, and you could even set that up as an establishment. I don't have to agree with you to love you. Because you can ask them, if they're a close friend, do they love you even though they don't agree with you? Disagreement does not mean hate. In fact, in some ways, disagreement can mean love. Because it's like, I see something that's hindering you from being the person that God wants you to be. And so I want to offer you something that might help along the journey. So I would focus on the gospel and focus as much on that as possible. The other stuff will begin to take care of itself. I know a woman, her name is Laura Perry. Laura Perry was transgender. She was far more masculine than all the women that she knew. She was very strong and very athletic, and she thought, something's wrong. My body is female, but my mind is male. And she went and she committed herself to that. She ended up falling in love with, or at least living with, a person who was a transgender male, who was actually a male who thought he was a female. Now, Laura would tell you she's not gay. She wanted to be with a female because she thought she was male. And so she went ahead and did surgery on her upper half. She had surgery on her upper half thinking this will make me feel more like myself. And she had all these hormone issues these hormone treatments that she had done. So she would grow facial hair and she would widen her jaw and do all kind of things so she would become more and more the male she thought she was. And then she suddenly realized after the surgery, I feel no different whatsoever. I feel exactly the same way. I'm still confused. I still don't feel like me. I don't know what's going on here. And then she comes and she embraces the gospel and she says, now I'm not saying it goes away every time, but she said, I suddenly realized I've been doing something to myself, trying to find identity for myself, when really my identity is in Christ. And she went back to living her life as a woman and is doing it right now. She's happily doing it. Now, is there consequences? I mean, she has had to have, if she hasn't already had it, construction surgery on her upper half. And she did, for the longest time, experience some after effects because she did grow facial hair. And like most men, when you shave your facial hair, no matter how close to shave you get, there's that little blue tint underneath your skin. She still has that. I don't know if she still has it. This has been years since I saw her in person, but she had that for a long time. So there are consequences to this. But she found her identity in Christ because she focused on the gospel, and the gospel got her to see what her true identity was. But another thing to talk about with these folks is to show them the love and care you have for them, because there are some statistics that are out there that are very important to understand. We're not trying to respond to an issue or a social phenomenon when we talk to our trans and non-binary identifying friends. We're trying to actually help a person, a unique individual. And so the statistics show this. Now, these are the latest statistics that I have, and I'm sure they're updated since then. But in trans-friendly countries that are extremely transgender friendly, so there's no social stigma, or at least very little social stigma attached to being transgender, people who actually go through the sex reassignment surgery, where all of their body is transformed through hormones and surgery into the gender that they think they are, those people are still 19 times more likely to kill themselves than the average person is. In other words, all of the pain and the suicidal ideation, it doesn't go away just because you've changed your body. That is a signal of something. That means that it's not the body that needs to be modified, it is the mind that needs to be addressed and healed and nurtured and cared for. This is the only issue in life, for whatever reason, this is the only issue in life I can see, and if I'm wrong, please tell me, where your mind and your body don't match up, and so we change the body. Why would we do that? We don't do that with people who are anorexic. We don't do that with almost anybody else. People who see things that aren't there, we don't say, well, you see things, and yet they're really there. We don't give them that. We actually say the mind needs to be nurtured and cared for. So I would express the utmost of care for them. I would focus on the gospel and also realize they've gone through some level of pain. If they're resistant to Christianity because of their parents' homophobia, there's pain associated with that. And so they don't see Christ, they see their parents. They don't see the gospel that God so loved the world. They see God so loved some of the world and hates other parts of the world. You have to break them of that stereotype and of that misunderstanding. Or not break them of it, but break their misunderstanding so that Christ can reach a broken person. I hope that's helpful. It's not an easy thing, by the way. It's a very difficult thing, but it is a worthwhile thing. Melinda Selmas is a transgender Christian woman, and she has gender dysphoria, honest gender dysphoria. And I would read to you her quote, but it's a long one. I'm going to just summarize it really quickly. She says that through her anguish and her suffering of trying to make her mind and her body congruent, she's not looking for fluidity, she's looking for congruence. She says, this pain and this anguish is actually taught me something about who Christ really is. People think that pain and suffering is a gateway to meaninglessness, that this world is meaningless because of the pain and suffering. She says, no, pain and suffering are often the greatest hints of meaning. So if someone is trans or has a gender dysphoria and they're feeling this sense of emotional anguish over it, that doesn't mean that it doesn't mean anything. We can walk with them in the suffering because, as Melinda Selma said, is that Anguish and pain and suffering is often the road that Christ used to transform us to look more and more like him, because anguish and pain and suffering is the hallmark of the gospel. She goes on to say that Jesus' pain on the cross was an indication of the value of human beings, and that John, when John saw, not John, it's in the Gospel of John, that when Thomas saw the scars, it was Jesus' suffering that identified Jesus as the Messiah to Thomas, the one who questioned. So it's our suffering that can point us to Christ, not take us away from him. So I hope that's helpful. There's a lot more to it than that, but it's a good start, is focus on Jesus, understand the suffering someone might be going through and what baggage is behind it, and then walk them through it and show them who Christ really is.
All right, thank you, Abdu. So we are actually running out of time now. I don't know if there's time for...
Let's do one more.
One more?
And if you want to be what's the next one, you got to jump up.
Yeah. So if there's anyone here who wants to ask a question in person, again, we can prioritize that.
Well, that'll guarantee that you get your question answered. Or you can gamble. All right.
If not, then, okay, last question for this morning. So this question says, how do we live in a society with a government that is moving away from Christianity and is trying to replace it with social justice, i.e. LGBTQ+, Black Lives Matter movement, etc.?
That's a great question. I think that the answer is this, is that, the gospel doesn't call us to be angry. It calls us to be faithful. When you look at the early Christian church, in the very first century, in the years after Jesus died. Now, I want you to notice something. I think I may have said this before at the Good Friday service. What did you have happen in the week or two after Jesus' death on the cross? And the reports were happening that maybe he had risen from the dead. You had a bunch of his disciples huddling together in locked rooms, afraid of what was going on in the outside world. Now that sounds a lot like lockdown. They just didn't want to go outside. They were terrified. Jesus walks through a locked door to reveal himself to who he is, and he says, Shalom Alechem. The first thing he says to them is, peace be with you. And he shows them the nail scars and the spear wound in his side. He shows Thomas this, and Thomas jumps out of that locked room, essentially, at some point, and goes and preaches the gospel in a hostile area and is martyred there. And there is a shrine in Chennai, India, that commemorates the fact that Thomas preached the gospel to those who did not know Jesus. And now Chennai and that area is a Christian area of India. My point is this, is that there was a hostile religious movement outside of the Christian faith in its early days. There was a hostile political environment in the Roman system outside trying to persecute Christians as well. But Christianity actually grew faster in the presence of oppression, persecution, and opposition than it ever did when it was easy to be a Christian in the United States, for example, or even in Canada. I don't know, some of you are too young to remember this, but in the 80s, it was fashionable to say you were a Christian even if you didn't mean it. I'm a Christian, sure. What does that mean? There's probably a God, but Jesus says be a good person, so I'm a good person. That's the largest religion in the world, by the way. That's no longer the case. Being a Christian is now comes with a price. Now, I'm not saying it's the same kind of persecution they experience in the East and the Middle East. I'm not saying that even remotely. It's not even close to being as hard here to be a Christian as it is in other parts of the world. The fact that we can gather here and actually have a sign out in the front that says, by the way, come and worship with us, is a testimony to that. There's other parts of the world, and you all well know this, where it is, if not illegal, it's as close to illegal as you can get to becoming a Christian and gathering together as Christians. So I don't want to make a moral equivalency here. Yet, there is an opposition. I won't call it a persecution, but there is a growing opposition to Christianity in the West, and it's being replaced by other ideologies and other issues. So here's the trick, okay? Why did the Christians grow in the middle of a hostile, even persecutive, religious and political environment? The Emperor Julian, the pagan Emperor Julian, gives us a hint at this. So Julian was a Roman emperor, and he was a pagan emperor. I think he had been actually in a Christian environment and then became a pagan, reconverted back to paganism. And he was lamenting the fact that Christians were making a bigger inroad in the Roman Empire than the pagan priests and the pagan authorities were making. In other words, Christianity was beating paganism, and he was bothered by this. He was so upset about it. So he wrote a letter to some of his generals, and he called Christians the impious Galileans, because he thought they didn't believe in our gods. That makes them impious. And these Galileans, because Galilee was considered, not only was the Judea a sort of like unimportant outpost, but Galilee was the least important part of the least important outpost in all the Roman Empire. So he was actually insulting Christians. But he says that it is to our shame that the impious Galileans are making all of the headway, because they care for not only the sick, indigent, and marginalized among their own ranks, but they care for those amongst us. In other words, Christians were ministering to those who hated them, and they were seeking the welfare of those who were against them. And these pagans were seeing, why do you care about us? You know, because we have a thing. Social justice is an interesting thing. I'm not sure there's another kind of justice, by the way, other than social. I guess private, I suppose, but even that's got its social atmospheres. But one of the reasons why Christianity is on the sort of the pointy end of the stick of social justice is because for some time Christians have been talking about justice, but we talk about just us. What we mean is we want religious freedom for us. We're not all that concerned about other people's religious freedoms. That's not fair, but that's part of the perception. But when we actually go back to a first century mentality, a second century, a third century, a fourth century mentality, where we don't see LGBTQIA+ or BLM as enemies to be vanquished or those who oppress, but rather people for whom Christ died, and we can say, look, there are some issues you are addressing that are legitimate issues. I'm going to say it, and it's clear as day. It is wrong to hate people because they're gay. It's just wrong. It's not Christian. You don't have to approve, and you can say there's a better sexual ethic, there's something better for you that the Bible has to offer, but to hate them is just wrong. And so I think with a government or a society that's moving away from a Judeo-Christian ethic is that we have to double down on living a Judeo-Christian ethic authentically and saying, I acknowledge the hurts of your community, I acknowledge the pain of what's happened to you, and in some ways there's still some things we have to work out. Things are not sunshine and rainbows right now, not for you. But I want to tell you, I acknowledge the hurts that even my own group has caused, but there's so much good as well. And so we need to live authentically, and we need to live in truth. And so don't always say sorry for things you're not actually responsible for, but you can say sorry for those things that we are responsible for. But then live that authentic life and show them that the gospel is a better story than the other things have to offer. These other issues, they might have a topical solution to the problem, but to get to the root, to get underneath the skin, you need the gospel. The gospel is what gets you there. So it fuels our change. It fuels our desire for change. So I would just suggest that we don't live shaking fists at the culture. Rather, we live with open hands that offer something of the beauty of the gospel to the culture. To quote John Piper, it's basically not boring to be a Christian anymore. It used to be boring. When everyone thought you were a Christian, it didn't matter. It was boring. Ho-hum, you're a Christian, who cares? Now, people listen. When you say you're a Christian, it's like, oh, and they give you that look or that statement. Well, that's a good thing in one sense because it means they're going to pay attention. They might yell at you, but they won't be bored. And to quote John Piper, he says, what the world is waiting to see, what might awaken some sense of Christ's value, is something salty and bright, something brilliant, some crazy sacrifice. He said Stephen's wisdom was undeniable, and his face shone like an angel. And so they killed him for it when he saw Christ, and he talked about who Christ was. He said, but they did not yawn. And he said in Acts chapter 8 and 9, Paul's conversion shows that Stephen's sacrifice was not in vain. The world is waiting to see something crazy and bright and salty, some crazy sacrifice. What I would offer to you is this, is that this is a world that is no longer bored by the Christian message. They don't think it's ho-hum, whatever. They actually take it seriously enough to be hostile towards it. That gives you and me more opportunity to shatter the stereotype and possibly shatter the hostility, because we can show who Christ really is. And to quote one last person, and then I'll finish, Charles Spurgeon said this, "Set yourself on fire, because men will come from miles around just to watch you burn." Burn for him. Thank you guys for having me. It's such a great pleasure. God bless you guys.
Well, thank you, Abdu Mary. So as we wrap up, again, just in case you missed whether this morning or the Q&A session, both will be on our SCAC YouTube channel. And so there's some, a lot of insight in the answers given today. And so if you want to rewatch that, that will be available online. And just a reminder, next week, our series, Why Should I Care If God Exists, wraps up. And Abdu Mary will be with us via video and for Q&A on Zoom. And so for any of the questions that you submitted that were not answered, we will queue them for next week as well. So thank you everyone for joining us today, and hope you have a blessed day. Happy Father's Day once more. And so take care as we all go. And thank you once again.